Our guest today is Professor Dr. Alejandro Crosthwaite, member of the Dominican Order. So you are very welcome, most warm-heartedly. And you are Dean of Faculty of the Social Sciences at the Pontifical University of St. Thomas Aquinas in Rome.
Yes.
The short name of the university is Angelicum. And you're a full professor of Catholic teaching, political ethics, faith and religion, cultural, mass media, and film studies at the same faculty. So, Father Alejandro, thank you very much for joining us today. The topic of today's conversation is digital communication and personal connection. And I think this topic is very important because in the midst of the coronavirus pandemic, in many cases, the only way to sustain personal relationship and communication has been digital communication. So grandparents and grandchildren who couldn't give each other a hug, teachers and students, and even members of religious communities who could only participate in holy masses via broadcasted masses, circle of friends, and so on and so forth. So we have all been forced to use the tools of digital media in one way or another. However, although digital media has proven to be life-saving from this aspect, from other respects, it has proven to be a double-faced phenomenon because now parents have also experienced their children having pinned down to their chairs, spending hours in front of the computers, and even one might even say that technology dependence and addiction to the screen has also probably grown in the circles of children. So therefore, it's very important to dive a little bit deep into this phenomenon of digital communication. So to have a closer look and analyze it from the Catholic and Christian point of view. So since definitions are always very important so that we know what we talk about, how would you define the term communication and its ultimate and even immediate purpose in our lives? And what elements of communications should never be let out of sight?
Well, first of all, thank you very much for the invitation to be able to participate in this webinar. So it's always a pleasure to collaborate with you guys. Okay, so communication, first of all, we have to look at the root of the word. And so the Latin root for communicatio is communicare, which simply means to share. So it's simply the act of transferring information from one place, person, or group to another. So that's the short definition of the word communication. And every communication involves at least one sender, the one who sends the message, the actual message, and the recipient, he who receives the message. And this may sound very, very simple, but already here we can see that communication is actually a very, very complex subject. So the transmission of the message from sender to recipient can be affected by a wide range of things. So this includes our emotions, for example, the cultural situations, especially now that media permits us to talk across continents and different cultures. The medium that we use to communicate, as you said, now we're using more virtual media as opposed to more face-to-face communication. And even the location we find ourselves can somehow affect the way the message is transmitted. And the complexity is why good communication skills are considered so essential, so desirable, so that we are able to have an accurate, effective, and unambiguous communication is actually extremely hard. So the biggest problem we encounter today, if we didn't already encounter it before in person, is miscommunication, or that somehow we don't understand each other or we misinterpret each one. Part of the reason for this is because the sender always encodes the message. So usually every message is a mixture of words, but most importantly, non-verbal communication. And here is where the medium that we use, so either it's in person or virtual, changes everything, because let's say the non-verbal communication that is transmitted by our bodies, by our sight, etc., doesn't necessarily translate through virtual communication. So it is transmitted in some way when we communicate this message in speech or writing, and then also the recipient has to decode the message to understand that which we're transmitting. And in order to decode that also involves what the person's capacities are of language, of understanding the other culture, of understanding the other person, and understanding also the medium that we're using to communicate. And of course, there may be more than one recipient, so it's already difficult one-on-one, but there might be a whole group of people. And the complexity of communication means that each one may receive a slightly different message. So the more we communicate to more people, the more the message can be distorted or changed or understood differently. So two people may read very different things into the choice of words that I use, as well as the body language that I use. This goes across cultures. So it is also possible that neither of them will have quite the same understanding as the sender. And again, the important thing here is this is already difficult on one-on-one communication. This becomes more complex as we separate the sender from the receiver, especially through virtual media. But also within the virtual media, we have a whole range of different media. So it could be, for example, Twitter, which is simply words and emicons, etc. So let's say that's the farthest away from face-to-face communication, as opposed to what we're doing right now through Zoom, where we can see each other, we can see some of our body language. So there's a little bit more clarity on the transmission of the message. Whereas if we were just texting via email or sending a tweet, it would be more difficult to completely understand each other. So of course, there are many, in face-to-face communication, the roles of the sender and the recipient are not distinct. So basically, when we're having a face-to-face communication, it's hard to tell who is the sender and who is the recipient, because it's a mutual interactive communication. I'm speaking, you're responding, you're interpreting, but you're also responding to what I'm saying, which I'm also decoding on your part. So it's a two-way communication. And this is what makes the whole difference between one-on-one communication and communication through other means, in the sense that the more virtual the communication is, the more it's concentrated only on one aspect of the message, the more difficult it is to actually communicate. And so therefore, the process of interpersonal communication cannot be regarded as a phenomenon which simply happens. Instead, it must be seen as a process that involves participants who negotiate their roles with one another, whether consciously or unconsciously, so that their communication may authentically communicate and connect in the short term and ultimately bring into full community. So here's kind of what you were asking at one point with regards to what does it mean to communicate as a Christian? So in general, as I already said by the definition of communication, communication is simply to share information. So to connect, to communicate and to connect with each other. But for us Christians, but not only as Christians, just simply as human beings, we need to have communion. That means not only sharing an aspect of ourselves, but our entire self in the process of communication. All of us are in need of intimacy. And so that only can happen in face-to-face communication. And I think it's no surprise that, for example, many people today with the pandemic that are using more and more the means of virtual communication still feel isolated. They finally understood that it's not the same communicating online than actually communicating person to person. The most wonderful surprise we've encountered during these times is little kids that usually it was difficult to drag them to school, to go to school. They didn't want to go to school, they wanted to stay home, they didn't want to do anything else, maybe communicate with their friends via Twitter, etc. Now that they're locked up in their houses and still having all this interaction with their teachers, with their classmates, with their friends, but only virtually, they definitely feel that there's something missing, that it is not the same. So even here in Rome, we had a protest basically of children begging the government to go back to school. Nobody would have imagined that 2 years ago, little children begging to go back to school because they immediately realized that we need that intimacy, but we need that one-on-one communication, and that somehow we lose that through virtual means. And so as important as virtual means is, in one sense, our means of communication have expanded. And we have more ways of keeping in touch, and not only with people that are close to us, but people that are far, far away through the whole world. So that's the beauty of virtual communication that really has connected more the world as world. But in the same process, as many statistics show, more and more people are feeling isolated. More people are feeling also depression, because what is missing? The human contact. So that contact that we can only get on one-on-one communication.
So thank you very much. And how, actually, we also have the same experience in our circles with children, that they were so eager to go back to school, even though they are still afraid of exams.
Yes, exactly.
That's also some kind of an ambiguous experience for them too. And how do you think that digital media could enhance our capacity or help us to proclaim the good news of God, and how can it hinder us? So what's the difference from this respect between digital media and face-to-face communication?
Well, the new virtual, the mass media, social media has opened a whole new world, that which Pope Benedict XVI called the digital continent. So we have a whole new continent that we have discovered, which is this digital world. And so just like the discovery of the Americans by the Europeans and other continents, it opens a whole new possibility of encounter with peoples and cultures and languages we never knew was possible before. So one of the pluses of this virtual communication, either through Zoom, through Twitter, through Facebook, through YouTube, is that we can get the Christian message out there to more people. And so that's the beauty of the whole thing, which before it was more limited. So we could only communicate with certain people, small groups, maybe through letters, maybe through correspondence, etc., unless we went there physically as missionaries to preach. Now we can be missionaries from our own homes. So we can proclaim the word through social media and reach a diverse group of people that sometimes they're not even within the church, that they're not even Christian, but people that are simply searching for answers out there, and that they're looking in the internet for these answers. And so now we have access to them. So that's the beauty of this. But as Christians, we also have what's called a theology of communication. And so this theology of communication, which basically is based on our belief that God is Trinity, so Father, Son, and Holy Spirit in communion, in dialogue, in perfect communion with each other, and that somehow God, from the very beginning of history, all that he has done is communicate with humanity. So from the very beginning is God communicating, giving himself to humanity, and humanity being the only creature of all of creation that's able to respond to God. That's what makes us different from the animals and the rest of creation, that we're the only creatures capable of responding to that call of God. And so that's what's called the Imago Dei, that we're created in the image and likeness of God, and that we have this capacity to be able to respond to God. And this communication of God with humanity is an intimate communication. It's a communion. It's really a communion. Is where God wants to become one with us. And so the Trinity itself, which is already that communion, reaches out to humanity, especially in the person of Jesus Christ. So Jesus, who we believe as Christians is both God and man, is God among us, Emmanuel, God incarnate, God who becomes one with us, becomes one in communion with us, invites us to do the same. So we ourselves are to become in communion with God, but also with all our brothers and sisters. So this is the great commandment, that not only are we to communicate and to connect, but we're actually supposed to create communion, common union amongst ourselves. So here's where the challenge of virtual evangelization comes. So virtual means social media can help us to communicate the message through the different media that we have. It can even help us to connect. So we connect because especially now we have a two-way communication system. So people, not only do I put the message out there, but people can actually respond in presence immediately to what I'm saying. So all that can be accomplished through the media. But what is lacking, where media cannot reach, is to the actual communion. So that actual one-on-one intimate union between each and every one of us, that cannot happen through virtual media. So virtual media can only take us so far in the evangelization process. It can communicate, it can connect us, but it cannot bring us to communion. So even within this theology of communication of the church, where the ultimate outcome should be this communion, ultimately it invites us again through come together in church, for example. And of course, the example par excellence is communion itself, where we receive the communion, we celebrate Eucharist together. And so, yes, we right now, because of the pandemic, the Eucharist is being broadcast. So it has given access to a lot of people that sometimes couldn't come to church or were not interested in going into church. And now actually a lot of people are following through social media, the Mass, the Eucharist, but there's that element that is still missing, that intimacy that can only be created in place, in one-on-one worship, as community worship together in community. So again, the Mass, the social media is a great tool for evangelization in the sense of communicating the message, connecting people together, even creating virtual communities. But what it cannot do is actually create communion. That can only happen in the parish, in the gathering of the fellow Christians together, to come together in communion, and also the Eucharist, because yes, we can have spiritual communion, of course, through online, etc., but it's not the same as receiving the Eucharist and really physically becoming one with God through the sacrament of the Eucharist.
And also that reminds us of the wonderful psychology of Jesus, who took into consideration our physical nature, so that the Eucharist is also a physical thing, not just a spiritual one.
Exactly.
So digital media is not enough for us to get to the final step, really, actually.
Exactly.
And as Rainero Cantalamessa, the preacher of Papal House, put in one of his books called The Mystery of Pentecost, if we accept God and God's will as the center of our lives, then everybody will go to the same direction and approaching the one with capital letter, which is God. However, if we're seeking only our own glory and our own will and power, then we will sort of disgregated. So we will be disintegrated within each other, I mean, within ourselves, and also in our personal relationships, and also we're getting detached from God. Whereas if the will of God unites people, that is integration, and that's what he calls one of the main differences between Pentecost and building the Tower of Babel.
Exactly. Yes.
So
so there's a whole theology also behind that. So let's say the theology of the Tower of Babel, as you just mentioned, it's Babel was the creation of the different languages, and so right now with virtual means, that's what we have access to all these different cultures, to all this diversity and variety that is the human race. So that's the beauty of it, But as you just also mentioned, the theology of Pentecost is that which unites, that which integrates, that which brings into communion. And so again, media can only take us so far. Virtual media can only take us to acknowledge each other, to communicate with each other, to connect the different cultures and acknowledge the diversity. But for the actual communion, that can only happen on a one-on-one basis. And so that integration. And as you also mentioned, this is not only a social phenomenon, it's also a personal psychological phenomenon, because we ourselves too are always balancing between our selfishness, to tend to kind of close ourselves in, have our monologue internally, etc. And then the call to get out of ourselves, to reach out to the other person outside, to actually be in communion with those people around us. So that struggle that happens personally between the selfishness and the self-giving unto the other, this we also see in the global context, where either through social media, because also, for example, social media allows us to be anonymous. I can use, say, an avatar or not put my real name, etc., to kind of just be a voyeur, somebody who just watches and observes, but actually does not give of self and does not really participate in the communication process. So that's part of the problem. Also can be a problem in media, that you can create this avatar, this false image actually, and transmit something that is not really truly you. And we do that at the personal level as well as in the public level. So that's the challenge. That's the challenge for us to turn communication into a communication of the truth, of who truly we are, and of the truth itself that needs to be communicated. And so also within our own persons, as well as in social media, this dark force is also there, which tends to be falsity, tends to the fake news, the famous fake news, that's where that enters. This kind of selfishness and closing ourselves in, where also we have today what's called tribalism, that we kind of only also communicate only with those that think like we do, you know, and we exclude everybody else. And the virtual media today gives us a lot of tools to be able to just communicate with those we want, you know, create a blog only for those who think like I do and reinforce what I think should be the truth or belief. And I don't give a voice to other people. I don't, it's not open to other people. And I don't listen necessarily to what other people are saying in their blogs. So this is also a problem that we encounter today, something we already had in the past, but also today is in one sense, we see a bigger cultural divide in the world where people are kind of becoming tribes, you know, where they only hang out, only communicate, only are friends with people that think like they do. And so communication is hindered also there. There's no communion. It's more a reformation of the self, of the self-image, which happens at the personal level, but also at the social level.
Yes, and it leads also to the problem of censorship from the social media hosts, so to speak. So that's also a different set of problems, that they only like to see opinions that are quite the same as theirs.
Exactly, and you know, and censorship is such a delicate topic. I mean, in one sense, we do censorship ourselves, as you said, in this tribalism, in the sense that we only listen, we only search out the media that somehow speaks to what we believe. And we kind of exclude, we censor anything that doesn't agree with us, you know. So as opposed to beginning a dialogue, which is what the invitation of Christ is, and of all the theology of communication of the church. And Pope Francis really emphasizes the theology of dialogue, that's important to dialogue with those who think differently from us, you know, because we actually might learn something from the others, but the others also might learn something from us. So dialogue, it's the main theology, let's say, of Pope Francis. No? But we tend to this self-censorship, you know, that we only listen to the voices we want to listen to and don't listen to other voices, to the voice of the other especially, which as Pope Francis will talk about, we need to listen to the people in the peripheries, the one who is other, who is different from us, in our minds at least. That's the one we need to reach out. And so there's a lot of censorship that we're doing. Also, there's general censorship in the sense that there are ideologies out there that are blocking certain messages, least of all the Christian message. Sometimes it gets blocked by the secular media. So they don't want to have this broadcast out there. So we also have that kind of censorship. At the same time, you know, there's the other kind of censorship that sometimes we talk, the ancient kind of censorship. Should we allow everything to go on media and virtual communication? Should there be some kind of censorship process? And I mean, at least experience has shown that that doesn't work. You know, what we really need to do is what the document on the formation or the training of priests for social communication from the 1980s states, which is we need to form Christians to be self-critical and to have critical thinking and to be able to see the messages that are out there and to be able to have enough of a faith formation, enough of media literacy to be able to understand what hinders communion and what promotes communion. So in one sense, in today's world, let's say censorship of the press, of the social media, it's impossible. You can't do it. It's counterproductive. What we really need to do is critical thinking, that all of us are trained in media literacy. And so we do our own censorship in the sense that I know that this leads to communion and this doesn't lead communion. Because ultimately, of all media, either Christian media or secular media, the ultimate goal of media should be to unite, to create communion, to inform and to create communion. That should be the real goal of any kind of communication, of any kind of media. And anything that goes against that is simply destroying the nature of communication itself. So we need to learn, I mean, that's what the documents of the church called us, that all of us should be have a media literate. We should be media literate, so that we know precisely, is this message creating communion or disunion, integration or disintegration? And so therefore, that's where the censorship would come.
Yeah, and that's a responsible of every one of us. So it's not just media professionals. So today's digital world is a profoundly different situation now than compared to like 2 decades ago or something, because now virtually just anybody can be a media professional, so to speak.
Exactly.
So our responsibility is tremendous.
Yeah, in the documents of the church, precisely on the training of priests and all these documents that talk about training Christian leaders in communication, before there was a very clear distinction between what they call basic training, which basically meant what I just said, media literacy, which means to understand how messages are created, sender, message, medium, etc., and also to be able to understand what is it that creates communion and what creates disintegration. So that would be the basic media, which everybody should have, every Christian should have, every person should have. Then we used to talk also about what's called pastoral training. So those are the people that use communication or mass media, etc., to proclaim the message of Christ, using the different means as that. So there was a way of preparing that. Then there was a third level, which was called the media professionals, as you said, the ones that actually produce media, especially in the Christian world, to evangelize. But today, the line between pastoral communication and, let's say, experts in communication has become blurred, because today everybody can be producer of media. And so basically now all of us need this kind of professional training, you know, that how everything works, how can I use this medium in an appropriate way to be able to clearly and succinctly communicate the message of the gospel, because every media would require a different way of communicating. So I think now today, all of us need even professional training in this sense, because all of us are also producers now.
Well, thank you very much. We only have a couple of minutes left, but there's one more important thing that I would like you to talk about, just a few thoughts to share with us. Why can we call Jesus the perfect communicator? So what are the elements of communication that we could follow from his example?
Well, I mean, with Christ, of course, who for us Christians is the embodiment of the Word. You know? So Christ is the Word. And so it is the Word of God that becomes incarnate, becomes a living Word within us, amongst us. And so Christ shows us precisely what God has intended from the very beginning of history, that God is a God of communication, God who in Trinity, you know, communication among themselves, shares that with the outside. And so who are the outside that can respond to that? Humanity. So that's the history, that's the love affair, let's say, that we have between God and humanity from the very beginning of our history, with humanity responding to the love, of humanity rejecting the love. This is where the free will of humanity comes. And as Jesus himself tells us in the different parables, especially the parable of the vineyard, is that God from the very beginning has sent different prophets, different messengers to communicate the message of God, the message of love, that he wants communion with us, you know. And the unfortunate history of humanity that keeps rejecting that message. And then at the fullness of time, God descends to send his only son. He himself comes to us to communicate the message. That's the great mystery of the incarnation, that God himself comes to us personally, physically, to live with us, to communicate this love for us, each and every one of us. And so that's why Christ is the perfect communicator, because he is the one that gives all himself unto the other. He is the one that not only communicates a message, not only connects with us, but also creates this common union, this communion between us and himself. And that's the message given to the apostles, and that's the command given to the disciples of Jesus, to love as he loved. So in that sense, to communicate, to connect, and to create this communion as he himself did. So ultimately, the model, the exemplar for us as communicators is Jesus himself. He who gave his whole self in the communication process. So also we ourselves are to give our whole self in communication unto others. And as we know also in the case of God himself, the best communion was when he came and lived among us, when he was Emmanuel. So also for us humans, the real true communication only happens, the true communion only happens when we give our entire selves face to face in person.
And could you give us some practical hints what we could take over from Christ's communication in our everyday communications, like being centered to the topic or being aware of ourselves and the audience, context, or what are the repertoire elements of Jesus's communication?
Yeah, I mean, it's like in any process of communication is, first of all, is important to know who the audience is. So we need to know who the other is. So that's where the whole communication comes also, and the connectivity that we come to. It's a two-way dialogue. It can never be a monologue, and which is the tendency we have. Either, especially as professors, we tend to do monologues. We preach the word, we teach the word, and so that's our biggest fault. And so what we need to do is really a dialogue, which is more St. Thomas Aquinas is the Aristotelian method, of really a dialogue of engagement one with the other.
Actually.
Yes, exactly. So that's what Jesus did. I mean, with the parables and so on, it was just not a teaching. It also made the hearer think about it. What does this mean? Who am I in this parable? And so Jesus never gave a straight answer. He always presented parables, etc. And stories are always, by their very nature, involve us. It sparks our creativity, and we engage. Also, is he talking about me? Who am I in the story? Etc. So immediately your brain begins to interact. And so that's what we also supposed to do when we communicate, and somehow to create this two-way dialogue. Part of it has to be, as you said, to know the other, who is the other, what are their questions, etc., to be able to have the capacity not only to speak, but to listen, which is something we've lost a lot. We really don't know how to listen anymore. Hannah Arendt wrote a book on the contemplative life, the active and contemplative life. And she says that one of the biggest losses in contemporary culture is the contemplative life. And contemplative life really consists of listening. Listening to God, of course, but also listening to each other. And we have lost that. And Jesus was a great listener. He listened to what people were really asking for. So he didn't kind of say, oh, this is what you need. This is what you want. He first listened to what the person said, this is what I want. And then Jesus responded with that and even more. So that was the graciousness of God, that he always gives in abundance, not only what we need and we're asking for, but even more. And so, but it starts with the listen. And so Jesus, first of all, listens. The word obedience, we're called to be obedient to God, comes from obedire, which means, again, to listen. So an obedient person is the person that knows how to listen. And so that's, I think, one of the traits that Jesus taught. First, we need to listen. Second, in that listening, we discover who the other person is and what they're really searching for, what they're really seeking. And then we connect with people where they're at. At that level, then we can bring them higher. But first, we need to communicate with people exactly where they find themselves, in their joys and in their sorrows, in their virtues and in their vices. We need to communicate with people first where they're at. Then we can bring them to a higher level, to the fullness of life, to the fullness of what they're called to do. And all of this is shown by Jesus' ministry and by God through the whole history of communicating with humanity.
Thank you very much. So this is a very good closing remark, and I hope this is a very good message to bring us in the future. So I really appreciate that you have shared your ideas with us and the Catholic social teachings, sayings about all these issues. So I hope that we will have a better understanding and better communication and communion with each other and with God also. So thank you very much again for.
Thank you very much again for the interview.
Okay, bye-bye.
Goodbye.
Thank you very much.
Okay, very good.
I was a bit afraid that we were running out of time because Peter has sent me a short message that the Zoom system will throw us out after 40 minutes, but
I see.
minutes, so it was.
Okay. So, yeah, I saw a little message that said you had updated at the time. So I saw that message that came out. So,
okay. So
okay. But then he'll edit it and so he can make it accordingly.
Yeah.
Okay, very good. So is there another process after this, or that was it? So I think
that was it.
Okay.
As far as I know, this is a series of interviews with 4 or 5 persons. You maybe know about that.
Yes, I do know. Yeah.
Okay, and there's going to be a roundtable discussion of some sort at the end in June or so.
Okay, very good.
And probably all of you will be invited to that, but I'm not sure because I'm not the organizer myself. It's just
yeah. Because that was what it's not clear to me if there was an ultimate gathering together or not. That was not very clear.
Yeah, as far as I know, there's going to be a meeting, probably a virtual meeting, I assume, on the 17th of June, if I remember well, but I'm not sure.
Okay.
And I think that all of the interviewers will be invited, but the only person who knows it is Laura, Sister Laura.
Okay, yeah, no, I'm sure, yes.
It was really great to get to know you, so I really enjoyed that.
Yes, thank you very much. Very good, a pleasure. Very good.